When we think of freedom and unity, we think of them as opposing forces. And so what we'll see is that this theme called freedom, expressed as spiritual sovereignty, is absolutely vital for not just our own spiritual evolution, but also our capacity to open up our hearts and embrace this other concept known as unity. So freedom is spiritual sovereignty. Unity is what we know as the universal oneness. There is a core theme in all of esoterica that you will find in almost all branches of mysticism, and that is the theme of freedom and unity. When we think of freedom and unity, we think of them as opposing forces. And so our job in esoterica is to be able to make these opposing forces harmonized. And so what you'll see is that freedom is the esoteric force known as spiritual sovereignty. Spiritual sovereignty is a very large topic. I've covered it in past videos, and I'll probably continue to cover it. And so what we'll see is that this theme called freedom, that is expressed as spiritual sovereignty, is absolutely vital for not just our own spiritual evolution, but also our capacity to open up our hearts even more and even wider to actually circle back and embrace this other concept or this other principle known as unity. So freedom is spiritual sovereignty. Unity is what we know as the universal oneness. We've seen the symbolism of this dynamic between freedom and unity within esoteric symbols, even if we don't know that that's what it was referring to. For instance, if you guys have seen the Ouroboros, but not just the Ouroboros when it's eating its own tail. That's a different principle. The Ouroboros when it's the snake in an infinity symbol. So if you guys have seen that esoteric symbolism of the snake in the infinity symbol, that's actually showing that what we're thinking of as one circular snake that's consuming its own tail is now no longer just a circle. Instead, we'll see it through the infinity symbol. And the reason why it's expressing itself through that visual is because it's showing that there are now not just one, not just a circle, meaning not just a oneness. Instead, now the oneness has become two, so that that oneness is now also split or divided into freedom. And this is the visual representation of freedom and unity. Freedom is the unique individuality of a person, but this individuality happens even at a cosmic level. So freedom can be the individual person or even a unique individual being. And unity is when unique individual beings merge or unify together to become a group consciousness. This unity happens by sharing a strong resonance. And that is why some higher density beings refer to themselves as a collective, but go by one name or title. So this core theme of freedom and unity takes place in many different ways. I've actually only seen publicly one teacher teach on this principle, and they were from the Rosicrucian tradition. So the Rosicrucian tradition is still very aware and preserving this knowledge. Where I have learned this from is Sufis. But you'll find this in one form or another in pretty much any branch of mysticism. And so what this is referring to then is something very core, very important, that's at the roots of this reality. If it's in many different traditions of mysticism, then that means that it is a universal principle that is behind all of this reality. Now, unity in this case, which is the other side of the equation, is known as oneness. And what that unity principle means is that we are all source consciousness. So when you see that we are all source consciousness, this is unity. This is the unified field of consciousness. But then through that unity, what you'll get is diversity or freedom, known as spiritual sovereignty. These two principles lead into one another. They can't oppose each other because everything can oppose each other. Everything can be out of balance, but they're not meant to. They're meant to actually feed back into one another. So we can also look at these two forces as being objective and subjective. So you have the objective truth, and the objective truth is that everything is playing out through source consciousness and is source consciousness. And then the subjective truth, or the subjectivity, is that we all are our own subjective version. We are our own subjective reality, known as the ego or personality. So even the soul can be looked at as the subjectivity, because the soul is on that own journey. And so the objectivity is the unity, and the subjectivity is the freedom or the spiritual sovereignty. Spiritual sovereignty is not against unity. Now, this is a fun fact. If you want to see people's dark spirits activated, they get really triggered by spiritual sovereignty. Archons and dark spirits really don't like spiritual sovereignty. They don't like the idea at all, and they will even work in a manipulative way in people to make it sound like, well, the reason why we don't like spiritual sovereignty is because it's actually disobedient, or it's bad, or it's going down the wrong path. And that's none of it. You actually need spiritual sovereignty to truly be in alignment with unity. You can't just be in unity. If you're in unity, you're in the infantile stage of a childlike mind. You do not have the adult mind. You do not have the evolution and the development that is why we're here. So when we're in unity only, that's just the inability of going through the individuation process. And that individuation process is coming from unity and then individuating, meaning dividing into freedom or spiritual sovereignty. And so that individuation process is a necessity. But what you'll find is that that freedom or that individuation process that's going on allows you to now embody more unity. So it allows you to open your heart up from a space of where you're evolved. You're no longer an undividuated part of a whole. You have manifested yourself. You have individuated yourself. And so when you're coming from spiritual sovereignty, what that does is actually now just have you be a stronger witness, a stronger evolved aspect that can look back. It can reflect on that unity and meet it now through its own spiritual sovereignty at an even larger and wider rate. So when a person goes through the individuation process that leads to them in freedom, in fact, every time a person oscillates between going into unity and then going into freedom, what's happening is actually a person is becoming more aware of their actions, and they come from a place of care, meaning that they realize that their own personality is having actions and having consequences and having all these different ripple effects, and not even in a bad way, just like in a neutral way. Like whatever a person's personality is, that's not against the divine, okay? There's no fight between the person's personality, which is freedom, and the person's higher self, or let's just look at it as unity. This is not a fight. The more a person becomes aware and the more a person becomes conscious, they start including into their own personality the consequences and the impact of the all, of that one, of others. And so because of that, the person themselves in their freedom starts to modify themselves in a way where they start to evolve their capacity. They start to change and transform themselves so that, not that they lose their personality. That's not why they're doing this. It's because that spiritual sovereignty now becomes more mature. And when a person becomes more mature, what they're doing is realizing that their own personality can absolutely fit into this whole, into the unity. Just like how an ecosystem benefits and thrives off of all of the diversity within it. So once that spiritual sovereignty becomes mature, because it's going to go through this a lot until it becomes mature. Okay, this isn't a one and done at all. What I'm explaining is an alchemical process. So the more a person's freedom starts to develop, it starts to grow into more than just freedom. Because freedom can also mean, like rebel without a cause, or freedom because it wants to pull away from the all. And all of those are fine. Those are even milestones in consciousness. But once that freedom of a person's own individuation process is used to reflect back on the unity, what happens is now there's a push and pull, an alchemical process within the person that takes place, which goes, wow, is my own personality and its programming, whatever its programming is, because there's so many different ways that the person's personality or ego gets programmed. So now it will reflect upon the all and go, is my programming even serving anything other than my programming? Is my programming just serving me so that I can feel very esteemed and validated in my own self-concept? Or is my personality actually expanding and expanding into now breaking away from the actual programming and evolving and transforming itself into spiritual sovereignty? So you need sovereignty. This is key. If you don't have spiritual sovereignty, you're just programmed. We could even look at it this way. If you're just in unity, you are just in the programming. Because this unity without the opposite side of it, its counterpart of freedom, is just hive mind. It's a lower aspect of true oneness. It's even, we could look at it as the shadow side of oneness, because a hive mind mentality is the shadow side of oneness. So it needs sovereignty, because not only is sovereignty linked with being able for a person to discern and to break out of their programming, you'll need that individuation process, but also at the higher levels of this alchemical process, spiritual sovereignty actually is also how we access our dharma. Not everyone has the same dharma, which is why it's called dharma. So because of that, dharma is equated with our purpose. Purpose is almost like an energetic signature. It's kind of like a fingerprint, right? It's something that your whole soul's journey has gifted and tailored and designed itself into certain gifts, certain natural abilities, and certain attributes. So a person who's becoming unprogrammed through going through that individuation process, after many rounds of this, they start shedding their hive mind mentality. They start shedding their programming. And that's when you'll see a person's natural purpose come through, not whatever the ego's conditioning and whatever the lower mind's own egoic desires or just hopes and fears are. So once a person goes through this process of spiritual development, what you'll see is that the person becomes spiritually sovereign, to a certain degree, because it's always going to be able to expand and evolve. So it's not just a final resting point. But spiritual sovereignty, let's say they start accessing it and they start running that energy through them. That spiritual sovereignty is how a person accesses their purpose and accesses their dharma. And guess what that does? That contributes positively towards the all. So do you see how the more a person is going through this journey of freedom and unity, and they go through these rounds of alchemical purification, and they go through these rounds of it, that they're not opposing forces anymore. Now you'll see that the principle, which is so important, which is why so many different branches of mysticism know this, preserve this, and teach this, is because at the core of our reality, that's actually what's happening. You're having objective reality or unity or oneness, and also the individuation process of having freedom, spiritual sovereignty. And that these two, just like the infinity symbol, feed back to one another in harmony. And so what you'll see is that this is also represented in the symbolism of two serpents that are twisting up and down, twisting up and down. What they're also displaying is the fact that one is freedom, one is unity, and that the journey is really harmonizing and balancing them. Because once again, they could be out of balance. I am not saying right now to consider everyone. That could really become neurotic if it's not coming from a truly discerning space from the person. So this isn't about just applying things for the sake of applying them. That would be called dogma. Instead, just recognize how these two forces play out in your life. And instead of trying to hyperfixate or be neurotic about how to make sure that every single person is considered inside your actions, instead, just realize the impact and the ripple effect of your own personality on the collective. And then whether from that witnessing and reflection, you realize that you can either modify them so that more of your heart space is included in those decision makings, in those contemplations, or not. And that's really the best first step and the strongest step to being able to start consciously participating in this. I say consciously because we are already participating in this process, whether we know it or not. The real meaning of spiritual sovereignty is to be able to navigate infinity. Because spiritual sovereignty doesn't mean that you don't depend on others and that you're not interconnected with others. So then, what does spiritual sovereignty actually mean if we're always connected to others, but we still are sovereign? It just means that you're able to navigate the multiverse. It means you're able to navigate infinity. It does not mean that you don't get help from others. It doesn't mean that you can't depend on others. All of those belong to unity. So spiritual sovereignty is just being able to use your own discernment, use your own evolution, to be able to be not so overwhelmed by the larger picture, not so even oppressed by the larger picture, and definitely not in fear of the larger picture. Spiritual sovereignty doesn't mean that you have to know all of the larger picture. But when you're developed enough and evolved to a certain point, you become spiritually sovereign. And what that really means is that without others or with them, you'll be able to navigate the larger picture. I hope this has helped bring you into larger unity and freedom. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for higher dimensional guidance through spiritual awakening. See you next time.